word, dharmanomics and dharmic capitalism. So, can you break down these terms for us, for our readers and viewers and watchers?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me in the show. I'm a big fan of your show.
Thank you.
I watch most of your episodes, even though it's some of them are many hours long. But anyway, so thank you for having me here. The entire series of my research it's a trilogy of books. The first part of it is Kautilyanomics, where I deal with third century BC, basically the Arthashastra. I spent at least 4 or 5 years working on the Arthashastra and creating an economic framework because most of the text on the Arthashastra, the translations are all on the political side of it. The Chanakya Niti that we talk about. But essentially, it's called Arthashastra for a reason, right?
Economics.
Yeah, because the Artha, the wealth creation that we're talking about, is something the core, it's the essence of the text. So I try to create a framework based on the text called dharmic capitalism. Basically, Kautilya's principle of dharma. Of course, dharma has many definitions. It's a multidimensional word, very difficult to translate. But for the narrow view of economic policy, I define it through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and social harmony. So these are sort of three components of the definition of dharma. And these map into things like institutions, clean administration, and they map to other constituents, which I show in the book. And eventually the output that we call about is three buckets that I see. One is a role of a state, which is quite strong, rule enforcing, yet doesn't micromanage. So, for example, if there is, say, trading between the both of us, let's say you're trading a particular good and I'm with me, there are certain rules which are set. If you violate the rules, obviously Kautilya is going to, punish you and give you the whatever punishments that's required. But he doesn't sort of micromanage in the sense that he doesn't tell you what are the types of goods that you need to trade, what is the quantity of goods that you need to trade, and when do you trade, and things like that. Right? So that is one sort of bucket where the state is quite strong but doesn't micromanage. The second is a very interesting component, what I call wealth creation by engaging with the world. Right? There is often this notion that that we sort of opened up to the rest of the world only post the 1990 economic reforms, right? And there is nothing further from the truth. In fact, for much of our economic history, for thousands of years, except probably the post-independence till 1990 period, we have been constantly engaging with the rest of the world. So there's been trade, there has been commerce, there's been exchange of ideas, people. Centrally to what Kautilya thought about was he believed in the idea of wealth creation by trading and by engaging with the rest of the world. Obviously, he felt the need to protect some of our interest, but he also strongly believed in the idea of sort of exchanging, and having commerce with the rest of the world. So the second bucket of this is wealth creation through a sort of a global approach. Third is what sustainable growth and welfare. Right? We talk a lot about sustainability, climate change, protecting the environment, and things like that. And Kautilya advocated quite a bit for this in terms of protecting the responsibility. But he was doing it through the prism of responsibilities. I talk about familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities. And through this, he advocates for sustainable growth and welfare. So these are three sort of buckets, outputs of what we called, what I've called dharmic capitalism in Kautilyanomics. So we spoke about dharma with definitions of dharma, and then the outputs of a strong state but non-intervening, wealth creation via globalized outlook, and sustainable growth and welfare. So in this book, I sort of map these ideas to contemporary Bharatiya concepts in terms of trade, labor contracts, inequality, all these thematic ideas. And sort of showcase Kautilya's reference or relevance to it. So that was the first part of this research, right? And then in Dharmanomics, what I do is look at this is sort of a sequel to the first one. So we looked at 3rd century BCE. So now we move to the Common Era kingdoms. So when I mean Common Era kingdoms, I'm talking about the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagar Empire. And then I extended to also Southeast Asian kingdoms, which means Cambodia, which is called Kambojidesa at that time, Champa, which is again Vietnam, and then the rest of the Southeast Asian, Java and Thailand and places like that. So my sort of thesis or based on my research is that yeah, all these kingdoms also have certain variations of these dharma-based economic frameworks. They might not be a one-to-one fit, but there are sort of different iterations along the way. But the base of this has been the idea of dharma. So then I talk about three sort of components again on Kautilian dharmic capitalism, which we mentioned, because the Arthashastra is mentioned in a lot of these places where they take inspiration from the Arthashastra. Second part is what I define as the dharmic ecosystem, which is basically temple-based economies.
Temple, yeah.
The role of the temple, we see it as sort of a primarily a religious institution, rightfully so. But beyond the religious institution, there is an entire sort of economic ecosystem that the temple generates or still generates in large sections of Bharat, especially in the villages. So the second part of it is what I call dharmic ecosystem. Third part of it is what I call Shreni Dharma. The Shrenis were basically corporate guilds.
Shreni, you start from the beginning.
Right, that's right. So I give a because the Shrenis have a very long history. They go all the way till even some of the Saraswati Sindhu civilization, where there are evidences of Shrenis. They are basically like corporate guilds in very simple terms, like modern multinational corporations. So they used to have offices or entities across Southeast Asia, where they are basically corporations used to trade, facilitate trade, but not just trade. They had a much bigger role in terms of the socio-economic roles and political roles, and they used to finance a lot of these entities like the Cholas and Pallavas and things like that. And they played a much bigger role. So they also constitute a very important part of what I call the dharmonomics apparatus. So we have the Kautilian dharmic capitalism, the dharmic ecosystem via the temples, and then, of course, the Shreni Dharma.
Shreni. Now, in the book, you draw linkages all through the book between governance and economics. And that dates back thousands of years. It dates, like you mentioned, Cholas, Pandyas, Pallavas, Vijayanagara kingdoms. Explain to us the linkage between governance and economics in these kingdoms and how it continued for centuries.
Right. So in very, again, simple terms, right? We have the state in general, and then we have the market, right? These are two sort of pillars of what you call modern economic thinking, right? The state is basically governments which give, they earn revenue from taxation, they invest in infrastructure, they stimulate the economy in various forms. And then there's the market. So the market sort of, works on its own terms. And then there is competition, and then it produces bigger entities, companies, and things like that, and drives the economy. The role of dharma is sort of a foundational thing as viewed through these kingdoms, as sort of a foundational thing which enables both of these to work really well.
So there was welfare state, but free trade.
Correct.
And there was this blend. That's what it seems from reading your book.
Right.
A mix of the two, right?
Right, definitely. So if you look at it, like there was, because essentially all these are all political players, right? I mean, they're all, even though they were monarchs and they had, a lot of power, they had to keep their, populace quite happy, because that's where the welfareism really comes in. Because they want to ensure that the lower halves of sections of society were always sort of not overwhelmed, or they had to be taken care of. So they had a sort of a welfarist approach where they ensure that poorer sections of people are supported through a variety of these schemes, or something similar to, I would say direct benefit transfer types.
In spite of wars being fought.
Correct. And that's the fascinating thing, right? If you really look at this period during this common era kingdoms, all these guys, I mean, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, all of them are fighting with each other in some form or the other during various phases. But one thing that was sort of common is that their economic prosperity was something the underlying economic prosperity was going on fairly well. Because if you look at the early common era period, most of the world's sort of GDP and GDP per capita, India and China were the top countries in the world. So that's why you see that a lot of the action was around the maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, because that's where the game was. And because most of the Middle Eastern trade, this was a sort of a segue to both the rest of Asia and from the Middle East. So that's why, for example, the Cholas had a lot of their ports on the southern coast, and they were sort of transient trades. I mean, let's take Singapore, for example, right? So Singapore is sort of a central place which takes you to the rest of Asia for a lot of commerce to happen. But much of commerce doesn't really happen in Singapore because it's a very small place, right? Similarly, in a lot of the ports that the Cholas had, it was a lot of these transient ports, but they played a very important role to ensure that the trade and commerce was happening. So it was something that, despite the wars, despite a lot of geopolitical tensions, I think the principles that these kingdoms had, in my view, were all based on some level of dharmic-based economic frameworks, and I think that helped to sort of go look beyond the political environment.
So the trade that was happening, the trade routes, the trade, all this happened while these wars were happening. The wars were happening within the framework of the subcontinent.
Correct.
Whereas when they traded with modern day Vietnam, Cambodia, Kampuchea, or you want to call it Kambuja, whatever you want to call it, or Thailand,
Right.
up till Java that you're talking about, the wars didn't go there.
Yeah.
Only the trade happened, cultural linkages happened, religiosity and religious linkages happened, but the wars didn't expand there.
Yeah, and also when people conquered, right, it's very important to understand. Let's take the example of Cholas, right? We all know that Rajendra Chola, which is Rajaraja Chola's son, he went across Southeast Asia and conquered or had battles in many of these places. Kadaram, which is Kedah now, is one of the sort of known places. But there's a reason why the Cholas did not rule these places.
Yeah.
See, once you go all the way till Southeast Asia, logically you should go and rule there for some time, right?
Yeah.
Because the underpinning reason behind, one of the reasons behind the conquest, for example, was to do with the guilds that I spoke about, the Shrenis that I spoke about. So there was a guild called Ainurvar. In Tamil, it means 500. The Ainurvar was actually started in Karnataka, but it expanded a lot during the Cholas. But it was one of the biggest guilds of those time. They played an important role in financing the Cholas and a much bigger political role. So they were trading, so they had entities across Southeast Asia. So they were trading, and China was one of their major destinations for trade. So they were going through, again, the Singaporean Straits of Malacca belt. There what happens is the Srivijaya kingdom, which was ruling the contemporary Sumatra, Indonesia. So they had a sort of a tiff with them, where they were not allowing these guilds to trade. On top of it, the Cambodian king at that time was also in touch with the Cholas, and he had some geopolitical conflicts with the Srivijaya kingdom. And this led Rajendra Chola to go and conquer, so that, one, the trading routes were cleared so that they could, go through. And then the geopolitical alliances that he had with a lot of these kings were also sort of sustained. So that led them to conquer and move. So what I'm trying to say is war and conquering was not the primary motive, right? Cultural exchange became a natural sort of extension of it.
Extension of trade.
Yeah, extension of trade. I'll give you another example, right? So in Kambuja Desa itself, Kambuja Desa is basically what I call Kambuja Desa is contemporary Cambodia, but in the post-Funan period. So when I'm talking about post-Funan period, it's about early CE, say about till about 6th century CE.
Geographically larger than what Cambodia is today.
Correct. A bit larger, much larger than what it is today. So during that period, one of the theories is how sort of these Hindu civilizations came about. That is, one theory is that a Vedic Brahmin from Kanchipuram, from a Pallava lineage called Kaudanya, he traveled all the way to Cambodia for trade, and then he marries a local prince called Soma. And then they, start a family and they start this kingdom, right? And that's how this is one of the theories which says that that's how this lineage began.
Like what happened with Korea,
Correct.
The princess from Ayodhya.
Correct.
There. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is a lot of common linkages of people who keep moving around for a variety of these reasons were happening, irrespective of the geopolitical element, and that led to a sort of a transfer of knowledge and transfer of culture as an extent. And that became a permanent presence, because even today, when you go, right, let's take aside the non-functionality of these temples and institutions, right? But even today, if you go there, the cultural facets are still, omnipresent.
So the Shrenis that you talked about,
Correct.
It in this dharmic ecosystem, they existed then do they exist now across these Southeast Asian countries?
No, because now, especially after the
Informally, I'm
correct
talking
informally.
about.
I mean,
Yeah.
they don't exist informally, but their sort of footprints are there in the sense when you go and analyze some of these places and try to see linkages of what happened, you would always move into one of these guilds, not just the Ainu River. For example, there's another guild called
Who the 500? Ainur is 500. So
correct.
how five? Who are the 500?
It was just a group of people in Karnataka who had started it, kept the name as 500.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't like a specific, but it's supposed to be a group of 500 people, right?
Okay.
Put it that way.
Oh, I thought there are 500 trades or whatever.
No, I think the members were 500 people,
Okay.
which led them to create the name of 500. And another thing is, see, these Shrinis were also, they had their own constitution, right? They had their own governance techniques.
So they're like unions,
Correct. No, I would call them corporations.
corporations.
Yeah, it's sort of a multinational corporation, put it that way, but in a scale probably much lesser than what we are today. But for those times, it was still something that that was significant, and they had their own governance structure, and each of them had their own sort of unique governance structure. And these governance structures are also based on the idea of dharma. Like like they used to have certain principles for each of their guilds, how they want to function. Because see, all these guilds are very egalitarian, right? They were very inclusive. They had people across walks of life. As long as you had some commercial sort of background, you could enroll yourself here. And then so their approach was very open minded. So that is one of the reasons why they were also quite inclusive enough to go across the world, right? To do a lot of these activities. So their perspective was very different. So what I'm trying to say is the common people's engagement with the world was far more sort of I would say influential long term in terms of the ideas and cultural exchanges than even say what the institutional or the monarchs were trying to do.
So also when you go to these countries, we don't know, for most lay people, you don't know how is it so similar to back home.
Right.
Especially for people from South India, when they go, how is it so similar? Of course, people will say, oh, okay, the food, the temples and things like that. But there's a whole ecosystem around that. You have a temple and you realize that there is a lane which is selling jewelry.
Right.
Right? They have rubies and emeralds and diamonds, and you see the jewelry, there is similarity to some of the South Indian jewelry. Right next to that will be another lane where there are craftsmen, there's a crafts bazaar.
Right.
You go further down, or you see another gully that linkages. So, the word Shreni is actually also that.
Right.
There are various linkages like this, and this is what runs all through Southeast Asia. Anybody going to these places.
Right.
So when you start talking about temples in the Chola, Pallava, Pandya, and the Vijayanagara and the whole ecosystem around that, it is similar in all these countries, right? So take us through that now.
Definitely, right? Because you see, the similarities are a couple of things. One is the architecture, right? So the architecture that these temples follow, some of them is a combination of Dravidian architecture, some of them is combination of North Indian architecture, but the temple structure.
Northeastern.
Correct, northeastern.
More than north.
Correct.
I've seen Assamese and
Correct.
those Manipur, Tripura.
Correct, because that's where the Mon Khmer, who are the origins. Correct, they're the ones who are sort of origins of before the Funan Empire. They trace some of their roots to that. So there is similarities in terms of the architecture, right? So and the grandness of these temples and monuments. Two is what I call the way of life, right? Which you talk about in terms of food, in terms of culture, in terms of exchanges, in terms of festivals, right? I mean, Kartik Purnima, for example, is celebrated across these places because a lot of them were trading from Orissa, or the coast of Orissa and Kalinga and all these places into Southeast Asia. So even today, you find that a lot of these, kingdoms still practice some of these, traditions that we have. So the second part of similarities is in the cultural exchanges, in terms of food, in terms of their the so-called way of life that we're talking about, right? So these two similarities are very, very stark, put it that way. Third is just the you share when you go to these places, right? I mean, let me give you an example. So I was one of my sort of first people whom I dealt with this book almost 10, 15 years back was with Dr. Nagaswamy, late Dr. Nagaswamy, who's a world-renowned archaeologist. He spent decades working on this subject. In fact, he's one of the persons whom I dedicate this book to because the work that he's done was amazing. So he used to tell me that in Cambodia, every village had a Shiva temple or a Shivling temple at some point of time. But when I was traveling through Cambodia, I think you'd also realize that as you walk through, you will see Shivlingas like every other
Yeah.
place.
Yeah,
So,
in fact, you say this that the Khmers owe their heritage to Kamrup. I'm quoting,
Correct.
which is modern day Assam in northeastern Bharat. Northern Cambodia, which is today's Laos, used the sea routes for trading. And then you go on to explain about details. Go on.
yeah.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to say is, in a physical sense, though these temples were not non-functional, you get a sort of a very strong feeling that there is a lot of correlation to where we came from, and it's physically seen, right? And that is another sort of element, because most of these similarities we feel through other experiences, but when you see it in a very stark way, I think it sort of appeals to you even more.
And those who own, I've seen in many of these, like for example, in Cambodia or in Laos, they still refer to as Kambuja.
Correct.
The Indians or the people of Indian origin who are like fourth, fifth generation who have lived there, they speak the local language. They practice Indian customs as well as local customs, but they still say Kambuja. There are people in Thailand who will still say Sham.
Correct.
For when they talk about, we in India have forgotten about it.
Right.
We call it Siam or we say Thailand, but they will still use some of them still talk like that.
Right.
And it comes as a shocker sometimes, like in when you're in Bali and the cab driver says, "What is your caste?" And it was like, why are you asking me the caste? You feel a little, but caste is a way of life for them.
Right.
They have not, they don't practice the some of the casteism that we have in India.
Right.
They mingle with other castes. They have their pujas, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
They just accept the hierarchy of caste without the negatives of the caste-based system.
Right.
So, and then there are economies evolved around that. In these places, there are still the flower guy who brings flowers and keeps it. So
Right.
you spend money monthly on somebody who's going to bring fresh flowers to you every day for your thing. So there's the whole economy around these temples, which you described happening in South India, continues in these Southeast Asian countries too.
Yeah, and that's what I define as the dharmic ecosystem, right? One is the temple as an institution by itself, right? The temple as an institution has its own, say, revenue, because people go into the temple, they pay for pujas or whatever it is. And then there is an entire revenue created out of the temple as an entity, right? As a religious entity. But as an extension of what the temple is, there's an entire ecosystem around the temple, right? In terms of, say, shops, in terms of tourism, in terms of people coming, even today, in many of the villages, right? I mean, most of the villages, especially in southern India, the central sort of engine of economic apparatus is a major temple, and then there are sub temples around, and they sort of are the sort of underpinning economic hub of that particular region, right? I mean, let's take, for example, in the United States, right? If you take some of these educational institutions, let's take Cornell University or Urbana-Champaign, most of them are basically university towns, right? But there's one university which is central, and that university basically runs the entire economy of that town, and then that town becomes popular. In a similar vein, but not a direct one-to-one fit, you find that a lot of these temples are already there. I mean, thousands of temples are already there at the moment, and they serve a very important purpose for defining that village or that community. And this is part of what I call the decentralized model, because you sort of decentralize all this to the village communities, and there is an economic activity hub happening because of that. Similarly, I mean, this is, in those times, if you really look at it, the temples played like four important roles, right? One is they were, large employment generators, which means because of the fact that they owned a lot of land, there was a lot of employment created because of the temple, right? Not just the religious part of it, but the non-religious part of it. Second is they serve as financial institutions, right? There's a reason why a lot of the temples, major temples in Bharat even today, are all within, say, an hour and a half from the coastal line. Because these temples were serving as banks and financial institutions to enable commerce. So the temples, for example, would lend out money to a lot of these traders and shrinis at a particular interest rate, for example, right? And they would use that interest rate for their maintenance or for some other social activity, right? So what I'm trying to say is they played a very important role as financial institutions. They also played an important role as what I call a VC or a venture capital fund does today. Where they had the potential to sort of invest in entities and promote some level of commerce. So they had that role as well. Lastly, they had a very important role, which happens even today, is what I call the redistributive role, right? We all hear about inequality, right? In very simple terms, inequality is basically the gap between the rich and the poor, right? So the more the gap is between a rich and a poor, the more people say there's inequality in society. So you ideally want to provide support to the poor and so that you try to reduce the gap. So especially, for example, in the Vijayanagar Empire, if you look at the plates in the Tirupati, temple, it clearly states that a lot of these temples were endowment-led financing. That is basically what happens is a bunch of rich people, say in the community, invest as an endowment into the temple, and the temple and invest into the temple's operational cost and provide.
No, but before that, you mentioned that how do they acquire the land?
Correct.
The reason I'm bringing this in, and I want people to read the book for this reason, is because when the Ayodhya temple was built, and subsequently there are criticisms which are coming up that, people bought the land, for the temple, and then from around the temple, it was bought by people, and the locals sold the land. They didn't get much, and now the value of the land has increased. But in your book, you write also that the locals also benefit when this happens. So first, the land is bought by the temple.
Correct.
And at the taxes aren't charged because
Correct.
they know that the local population is going to benefit by a temple coming up out there.
Correct.
So go into that first, and then the endowments which come to the temple.
Yeah. So basically, the thing is, even though these are all monarchs, right? I mean, there are a lot of private land that is available, right? The kings had certain amount of personal wealth, but beyond that, they were sort of supervisory of the public land that is available. So the temples had, because of their wealth and their presence, they were able to buy a lot of these properties. And these properties were again, given to people like with tax exemptions, for example, so that they can participate in activities, commercial activities, which over a period of time is supposed to give them benefit, right? And that's how that ecosystem. Their argument was that over a period of time, either 5-10 years or whatever, this ecosystem would develop in a way where that area will really benefit from the creation of these entities like the temples and things like that.
So there's birthing pangs for the first couple of years when
Correct.
people have to give up their land.
Correct.
But it benefits in the not just long run. It just takes a couple of years
Right.
for temple activity to begin
Correct.
in that area. And commercial activity.
Correct. And note that this is not a 10-year, 15-year project, right? People are looking at thousands of years.
Thousands,
right?
yes.
Because because the religious element of the institution ensures that because it's linked to faith, it is a sort of an eternal enterprise.
Even now, Tamil Nadu gets, I think, I don't know the exact figures, but the religious tourism that comes into Tamil Nadu as a result of the absolutely gorgeous temples which were created thousands of years ago, it far surpasses any of the other kind of tourism that comes into the Deccan region.
Definitely, right? Not just that, right? I mean, one is the tourism that you talk about. Another is the revenue that the temple itself generates, right?
Yeah.
So there is a quite a bit of a strong case for liberalizing these institutions because then they have a potential of really expanding economic activity in a lot of these places.
In your book, you talk about the labor participation in the economic growth of the Chola Empire.
Correct.
And in this, you talk about inscriptions which during the Rajaraja I's reign. And just to explain, many people who go to these temples, they don't figure out what these inscriptions are, because if you don't know the local language, or if you haven't studied much, you don't have a guide who explains it to you, you really wouldn't know, because there's just the male male employees or people who benefited. There were temple servants. These are dancing masters, musicians, drummers, singers, accountants, parasol bearers, lamp lighters, watermen, potters, washermen, barbers, astrologers, tailors, carpenters, goldsmith. There are so many that you see. Now, why are they carved in the temple? I will let the author explain that. These are the people who are actually working around that temple. So for people who think that it's only pilgrims who go and they put a little bit in the hundi and that's the employment activity that happens around a temple. No, there's a lot more that happens. Please explain to us about this.
Yeah, so let's take the Brihadishwara temple, right, which is probably the most famous among what we're talking about. So when you go to the Brihadishwara temple, the on the sides of the temple, right, when you
Yeah.
there are most of these inscriptions are all on the sides, right? There's a sort of a lighting that you see, but of course the script is in ancient language, but much for people who are interested, a lot of these inscriptions are all digitized, right? So you could just do a Google search and try to find them online, and what they do is, you see, they reflect a sort of they provide you a perspective of how people live their lives. And the fascinating thing is there's due credit given for everyone, right? It's not like it's done in a very coherent, sort of sophisticated way. For example, most of the inscriptions start off with a sort of a eulogy to praise, even the kings praise Lord Shiva, and then go on to talk about some of their activities, how some of these
There are
loans were
some
given.
places where there is even a small shrine for the architect.
Correct, yeah. So,
That's the respect for
correct.
even that.
Correct. And imagine, right? They had the foresight to do this thousands of years ago because they probably realized that this was something that will be eternal, despite whatever natural calamity happens over a period of time. The fact that we are discussing about this today is because of that foresight and an ability to sort of put this in these inscriptions. Which again, these inscriptions, we need to view it in a much wider perspective, right? Because how in general for economic history or economic history research, I take a sort of a triangular approach. One is what you call real data, right? What is the real data that is available? Again, data going back thousands of years is a bit sketchy, but there are some data points that are available, right? So that is sort of the data side. The second is what I call secondary research, right? Which is what your inscriptions across board. What is the overall message that these inscriptions provide, right? In terms of trends, in terms of analysis, in terms of principles, because most of them are sort of prescriptive. They will say that, this king gave this much to this person and this person benefited, he provided a loan to this person and whatever it is, right? But you have to find the underlying message or theme across these inscriptions to derive a sort of a framework. So the secondary research provides you a lot of content for that. Last part of it is what I call anecdotal research, right? You have a lot of these travelers during these times, who talk about a lot of these empires in various travelogues. For example, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a very popular book. There's a Chinese embassy notes. The Cholas, when they sent missionaries to China, and there are embassy notes which talk about this. And then there are travelogues by Greek travelers, Chinese travelers who talk about. These are all independent people who just travel across the country.
Who mentioned that there are craftsmen, artists, singers,
Correct.
construction workers, cooks, all these people employed in areas around the temple.
Correct. So this is what.
It happens even till today.
Correct.
There
Correct.
are the dhabas.
Correct.
There are the Vaishno dhabas. There are the other dhabas.
Right.
There are medicine shops. There are, activities, economic activities which were not there
Correct.
earlier.
And just to close that point, right? So the triangulation of research is very important, right? Because you can't just look at one data point and then make an assessment of it, right? So, for example, if you take the Padmanabha Swami temple, the amount of treasure and wealth that has been there in the temple is huge in terms of even contemporary, GDP and GDP per capita. So using just the data points does not give you because the lack of veracity of data is not the way to approach it, in my view. So it has to be a sort of triangulation, which I talk about, which then gives you a sophisticated overlying picture of what led them to be sustainable. See, the fascinating thing about this entire exercise is we are talking about at least 2,500 to 5,000 years, right? Which means, within a span of 100 years, we are seeing so many geopolitical changes. The idea of a nation state, so many structural changes to the way we live. Imagine 2,500 or even, more than that, right? Which means there are certain concepts which are sort of eternally sort of ensured the sustainability of some of these systems. And that again is eventually boils down to what I define as the way of life. Because most of even in our contemporary, spending, let's take discretionary and non-discretionary spending, right? Non-discretionary is something that you have to do for day to day, right? For health, for, those things that you cannot avoid. Then there's a discretionary spending, right? Which spending that you make out of your own choice. Sort of, I would say, luxury items. Most of the discretionary spending is linked some form or the other to your cultural activities or cultural ecosystem in some form or the other. For example, if you want to buy a clothing, right? Most of you do it either during, say, a Diwali or during some other major festival, right? If you look at the UPI transactions, even today, most of this during the festival period, cyclically, really, the transactions are much higher. Which means that what I'm trying to say is for the discretionary part of it, we still use
Festivals.
the cultural ecosystem as sort of a driver of our decision making, right?
Yeah.
And that extends to even economic choices that we make everywhere else, right? And in the case of India, in Bharat, this is far higher propensity than in other countries.
Isn't it the same in the Western nations? Christmas is where most of the sales happen. Even, I mean, if you see globally also, diamond jewelry, diamonds, sale of diamonds, that happens at that time. Big purchases of land and all happens at that time. Acquisition happens at that time.
Right, definitely. But the fact that through the year we have so many festivals and so many sort of
okay.
Ours is, I mean, at least the Bharatiya sort of
Is not one festival. Okay.
Correct. It's sort of across the year, and in the West, see the amusing thing is that in the West people have done a lot of research on this. Gary Becker, who won the Nobel Prize for economics, started some of his work on some of these, on the role of cultural discrimination and things like that. George Eckelsdorff, who won the Nobel Prize in 2001 on asymmetric information, he's done work on identity economics, right? On the role of identity and society and culture, and the role of norms and narratives in economic decision making. So what I'm trying to say is this is not some niche topic. I mean, there's a lot of contemporary research which is done outside Bharat, but unfortunately, we are the cradle of cultural civilization, and one of the attempts here is to also sort of establish a qualitative framework which tries to give you a perspective of what this way of life is. Because if this way of life, which is proportional or has a lot of significant correlation with our economic decision making, can be studied further, then it can also make policy far more effective, right? If you're able to sort of understand this a bit more. Say, for example, the Mahakumbh is happening. So the Mahakumbh will have the greatest, largest, I think, congregation of people across probably the world at one point of time. So this is a great sample size for you to, if there is any policy narrative, say, for example, either the Swachhata initiative or other initiatives, it's a huge sort of opportunity to sort of project your message and get it across to people using the cultural sort of narrative as a positive driver to enable greater policy effectiveness. Then, because the way of life is a thousands of years entity, right? You don't need the state to come and tell you how to do these things. You do it because you are living. Your cultural background provides you the impetus to do it, right? So it's not like some external entity is coming and telling you to do it, right? So it's a natural way of life. So if policy can be aligned to this natural way of life rather than the other way around, where a bunch of people sitting in Lutyens' Delhi, tell you for what to do, and the people have to adjust their lives to that. You rather have it the other way around. Then it becomes far more effective. Yeah. Because you're aligning to what the people are naturally sort of aligned